All right, so we've got the third article from this Spiritual Sword, A Handy Guide to Preaching. And the subject is Training Faithful Preachers. Alan Webster wrote this article. Alan, of course, is the brain behind House to House. He writes most of the articles that appear in House to House. He wrote probably every tract that we have up on the wall over there. He was also the man who started polishing the pulpit with some of his friends from preaching school. They got together. It started out with just a few guys. They got together for a weekend away from their congregations to talk about what they were preaching, what they were planning to preach, and it's morphed into this huge event every year in Tennessee. And I cannot remember the numbers that they gave last night, but it was into the thousands of Christians, not just preachers, but Christians that all gathered together there in Sevierville to study the Word, to become better preachers and better teachers. And I kind of want to approach this from that aspect of training faithful Christians, because all of us should eventually get to the point where we can teach. We can sit down with somebody and we can share the gospel with them, and we can help to instill in them a love for Jesus and a love for the Word. Now, keep that in mind as we go through this, because I will slip back into this is how we teach preachers. But remember, when I'm saying that, that includes everybody. Because everybody should get to the point where they can teach. Okay? And when you get down to it, that is the primary function of the preacher, is to share the Word of God. And so that's what we are trying to do. Brother Webster starts his article by talking about the 12 preachers that God used on opening day in Acts chapter 2. Now, of course, that's the 12 apostles. 11 who had been apostles during Jesus' lifetime, and then Matthias, who was later added on. He had been with them that entire time, but he was not considered an apostle until Acts. They had some enviable training. You know, sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to have spent the entire day with Jesus for 3.5 years. He had him for about 40 months. He demonstrated and explained a preacher's work. He patiently answered their questions. He corrected their flaws. He didn't overlook the areas where they needed to do better. To become a faithful preacher or teacher or Christian, it is vital to sit at the feet of sound, capable, effective, and balanced men. A preacher rarely rises above his teachers. Many promising men are ruined by unsound institutions, unbalanced approaches, and ineffective instructors. So Brother Webster here, he looks at 3 different schools of thought or philosophies behind training preachers and training teachers. And he goes back to the Old Testament for the first one, and he calls it Samuel's method. It's a school of the prophets. This is the Hebraic way of doing things. There were at least 3 Old Testament schools for prophets, from Samuel to Elisha. Scholars do not know the curriculum or the methods. Those things were not handed down to us. But students lived in a community, and they were often called the sons of prophets. You see that several times in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. These were the forerunners of preaching schools and Bible departments. Much more is learned about swimming after one gets wet. I could sit up here and tell you how to swim all day, But once you get in the water, if you don't know how to swim, you still ain't going to know how to swim. When I started preaching full time, I only had 1 year of preaching school behind me, and I continued on for 3 more years online. But I tell you what, there were a lot of things that happened to me during those first few years that were never discussed in preaching school. And so, I mean, there's just situations that you're not going to know how to handle until you're put in that situation. And even then, most of the time, you just learn how to do it better next time. It's just the way it works. We learn from our mistakes. These schools of prophets employ daily teaching. They dealt with personalities, views, maturities, goals, situations. All of these things yield an education that flows upstream as another goes downstream. The tools that Brother Webster explains here in this article emerge from trial and error, prayer, thought, feedback, and observation. And there are many teachers who would likely agree with many of these, but also employ other methods. I don't do everything that Brother Webster does, that he talks about here when I teach my students on Saturdays. It's not something that, it's not you have to do it this way or you're wrong. This is one of those matters of opinion. And there's different ways to approach it. First, he talks about the classroom. How can we best use class time, which is the heart of preacher training when you're in a school setting? The Memphis School of Preaching, the Georgia School of Preaching, the Online Academy of Biblical Studies, all of those things. You have those students for that limited period of time. And so you have to make best use of that time. And number one, Brother Webster says to plan a calendar. This also applies to teaching in a local congregation. If you're teaching the youngsters, if you're teaching an adult class, if you're teaching the ladies class, you make a plan. You don't just go week to week. Well, what am I going to teach next week? You need to have some sort of a destination that you're going. When I started preaching, I did not do calendars. I didn't pay any attention to that. I didn't think about it. And every Monday started a week-long stress session. What am I going to preach next Sunday? And it repeated itself every week. When I came down here, I decided I'm going to change the way I do things, and I'm going to set up a spreadsheet of what I want to teach. There's some flexibility in that. When some things need to change, I can change those things and tackle a different subject or go a different route I'll give you an example. At the beginning of this year, it was actually last year that I made the decision. I said, I'm going to preach through Ephesians and Colossians in 2022. And so for the first 7.5 months, I guess, for the first 7.5 months, we were in the book of Ephesians almost every Sunday morning. I don't know if y'all noticed that or not. But just start with verse 1 and we go all the way through. We covered every single verse in the book of Ephesians. And I got through that and I looked at Colossians, and you know what? Colossians is so similar to Ephesians. I thought I could tackle it from a different angle, but I just felt like I'd be saying the same thing I had already said a few months prior. And so for a few weeks I did the week-to-week thing. Well, I've gone back to my schedule. We're not hitting Colossians yet, but I'm hitting different, smaller books until I decide it's time to hit a larger book. The way the calendar is important for me because it keeps me on track as a preacher. It keeps a teacher on track because you have a curriculum. You know what you want to address. We're following these on Wednesday nights. We're going through this as our curriculum. And so I don't have to sit down and think, well, what am I going to preach or teach about next Wednesday? I just look at the table of contents. Okay, we're going to look at the preacher and his work next week. It's pretty simple. to use a method, a tool like this, or Gospel Advocate has some curriculum, and there's curriculum for the youngsters that is geared towards their age. Planning this calendar is important. And one of the things that Brother Webster talks about is sticking to that calendar and staying on track, because when you get through, say you want to get through the entire chapter in 1 week, and you get up, there's 25 verses, and you get up to verse 20, and there's only 5 minutes left. It's a lot easier to go ahead and finish that up that night or that day than it is to say, we'll finish this up next week. Because once you do that, you're going to throw off your entire calendar. Now again, we've got some flexibility on Wednesdays. There's some of these articles we probably won't cover. We didn't have class last week. We will probably have some weather events that will cancel classes at some point this year. That's just the way it goes. So we've got some flexibility with it, and you've got the study materials with you, so even if we don't go over it in class, you can still look at it at home. But staying on track is important. It allows for a rhythm and for staying ahead in preparation. Brother Webster says, come to class excited. And as a teacher, sometimes that's not always easy to do. Because we have lives outside the church building, don't we? My wife has been dealing with some health issues for the past week and a half. And that adds on some stress. And I've got a class that I teach on Saturday that I'm not ready for yet. That adds some stress. And so we've got things going on outside the building and outside this particular class, or whatever class you may be teaching, that's going to affect your energy level, that's going to affect your excitement level. What you have to do is just set some time aside before class starts and pump yourself up, pray, and look at what you are going to get to do while you're teaching or while you're studying. And so you really have to bring your own energy to class. Students feed off of the teacher's energy. And if you're teaching youngsters, you got to keep up with them because they will run you ragged sometimes. But you've got to play off of their energy, and they will play off of yours as well. You have to determine a teaching style. Whether it's lecture or discussion, whether you're using PowerPoint or questions and answers or notes, or a curriculum like this where you have assigned reading to do and going through those things. Alan talks about how he divides his classes into 3 segments. He covers the text in 3 waves, asking 3 different questions. And these are good things to do during your personal study as well. Number 1, look at what the text says. Just face value. What are the words that are used? Words are important, aren't they? And it's important that we understand what the words are that are being used. He talks about Bible marking. I do this sometimes, but I'm so bad about keeping up with it. I've got about the first 7 chapters of Revelation marked up. I finished studying Revelation years ago. And then we even went through it again here last quarter on Sunday mornings. I still haven't gotten past what I did a few years ago. It takes time. It takes time to get in there and dig into it. Marking the Bible is interactive when you do it in a class setting. There's a focus that is on the text itself. When you're doing Bible marking, you're not looking at the commentaries and things like that. You may be using study aids that tell you, okay, well, this word is used here, it's also used here, and you want to cross-reference those. And so that's a good way to to mark the Bible. In the book of Revelation, there's a lot of references to Old Testament things. You can mark, okay, well, Daniel talks about this, Ezekiel talks about this, and that's a good way to kind of help yourself remember what it says. He talks about the different ways to mark the Bible using different highlighters, underlines, asterisks. What I did with Revelation, here, I'll actually show you here. What I did with Revelation when I was doing this, I would highlight a phrase. So I highlighted a phrase here with blue, and then I wrote my notes over here and highlighted my notes with blue. So I know that these notes go with that phrase. And that's just the way I decided to do it. There's a lot of different things that you can do. Some people just highlight, and there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes it's good to have a note marked down. Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1 and verse 8. This is the very first notes that I made in this Bible when I purchased it. Paul says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. I underline the words, your faith." And then I put in the margin, Romans 16:19. So if you turn over to Romans 16 and verse 19, "For your obedience has become known to all. Therefore I am glad on your behalf, but I want you to be wise in what is good and simple concerning evil." I underlined your obedience. And I wrote in the margin, Romans 1:8. Your faith is known throughout the world. Your obedience is known throughout the world. Paul is making a connection between faith and action. Your faith, which motivates your obedience, or your obedience, which is caused by your faith, is known throughout the world. Faith does not live mutually exclusive from works. And Romans, of course, is one of those books that the faith-only advocates love to use. But Paul shoots faith only down by connecting faith and obedience in chapters 1 and 16 of Romans. So that's just one example of what I did with Bible marking. There's a lot of other things that he talks about here. Key words in the book of Mark, straightway, if you're using the King James Version. Straightway is a common word. In the book of Hebrews, better. 1 Peter talks a lot about grace. 2 Peter about knowledge. 2 Peter chapter 3, beloved. So there's a lot of things that you could do with Bible marking. Question number 2, not only what does the text say, but what does the text mean? Now this can get tricky. I'm not asking you what does this mean to you. Because what it means to you is the same as what it means to me. Hopefully. Yeah, I mean, that's the way God designed it. He did not write this so that everybody could get a different understanding of it. God's not the author of confusion. We're not private interpreters. We have to look and see what the Bible says and determine what it means for mankind. Not for me individually, because if I look at it that subjectively, it could be something different than what it means to you. So we need to be careful that we don't get into personal interpretations, but we look at what is God trying to convey to his creation with what he says here. Ask a student to read the chapter aloud. stopping at paragraphs or outline transitions, then explain it in simple words, giving the flow, connecting the verse to the paragraph, the chapter to the book, and to the Bible as a whole. Define unfamiliar words. This is something that I struggle with in teaching and preaching, because I'm like, everybody knows what that means. No, not necessarily. You cannot assume that everybody knows what it means. It may be elementary to everybody there, but if it only takes you 5 minutes, or not 5 minutes, 5 seconds to say it, just in case there's somebody that doesn't. I'll use the example when I use the King James Version, and it talks about let your conversation be holy, and I'm not pulling the verse out of my head right now, but when it uses that word conversation, it's not talking about a discussion, because that's not what the King James language meant. In 1611, the word conversation meant your conduct, your behavior. Explain that. Every single time you come across the word conversation, if you're using the King James Version in a teaching situation, even if it's a reminder, you remember what conversation means in 1611. Is conduct, is behavior. He's not talking about talking, although that's a part of it. But so explain things even if you think it is elementary, and even if you have said it before. There's nothing wrong with a simple reminder.
I was in a congregation once where there was a new convert, and she said one of the things that really bugged her in classes, the people would say, well, you know the story.
Right.
And she did
There
not
are people that
have
don't.
any background in Bible.
Yeah.
She didn't know the story.
Yep.
I mean, and she would want to know. And I remember when Jason first started going to church with Jennifer, they'd be reading stuff from the Bible. Well, he's keeping on reading because he hadn't heard this before, and it was like he wanted to see the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's important to do that. Now, you may not always have time to go into depth on every, when we talk about Noah.
Yeah.
Just to use one of those things that is widely known, even outside of religious circles, but you still don't want to gloss over it. You know what happened with Jonah. You know what happened with Abraham. You know what happened with Elihu. I don't even know what happened with Elihu. I'd have to look it up. I can't remember off the top of my head. So there's things you do have to be aware of that. And, don't assume everybody is at the same level. And I think he actually gets into that a little bit further. Well, no, I jumped it up first. It's down there at the bottom of page 10 on the second column. Don't assume that what you see in the text is obvious to everyone else, because it's not necessary. Sometimes it does take somebody to say it. It's important for students to learn how to study. It's more important that they learn how to learn. It is most important that they learn how to think. There are things that were taught in different, quote-unquote, sound congregations back in the 1950s and 60s that we look now and we say, that wasn't right. And it's led to different problems among some circles. And so we have to get in there and just don't take the preacher's word for it. Be like the Bereans who searched the scriptures daily to make sure the things that Paul and Silas were teaching to them, make sure that they were being honest with what they were teaching. Paul was an inspired apostle. Silas was an inspired evangelist. And the Bereans still wanted to go back to the Word. We have to go back to the Word. We have to look at what it says to be sure that we're doing and thinking the right way. The third question that Brother Webster talks about, first he says, what does it say? Second is, what does it mean? Third, how does it apply? In the third wave, take students through the text, applying the lessons. This is one thing I love about those Truths for Today commentaries. At the end of each chapter, they have an application section. And Brother Clover and other writers contribute articles to say, okay, look, Isaiah says this here. Let's expand that thought some. How does that apply to us today in the 21st century? When Isaiah was preaching to 8th century Israel, 8th century BC Israel. Well, how can we take that 3,000 years later almost and apply it to our lives? And so it's good to look at application. Preacher training is academic. It has to adhere to high standards. But if that's all there is, it woefully underprepares men to preach. Jesus taught fishermen, a tax collector. He taught a political zealot. And he was able to reach each one of those. And they were his apostles, his very closest students. And he was able to reach them and teach them at a level that they could understand and prepared them to go out and teach others. He discussed practical topics that were interesting to regular people. You go through the Sermon on the Mount, and if you don't come away with something, you know what, I never thought about it that way before, then you've either memorized it and learned it a long time ago, or you didn't read it very carefully. One of the two. But he talks about everyday problems that we face. He talks about covetousness. He talks about greed. He talks about worry and anxiety. He talks about hatred. He talks about lust. He talks about all of these different things that we can apply to ourselves in the 21st century because it is a human condition. It wasn't a cultural thing that Jesus dealt with. It was something that applies to everyone. He did not deal with the minute details that the scribes often argued over. Remember, he told them they were straining at gnats? Now, that does not mean, and Brother Webster puts that in here, it does not mean that the church does not need scholars who handle academic challenges to the faith. Eric Lyons and Kyle Butt, Dave Miller, and the other brothers that are working with Apologetics Press, they're way up here, all right? I could never write at their level. There's a lot of times that I don't understand what they're saying. There's a lot of times that I do, though. We have to read it so that we can share it with some who may be dealing with questions over the existence of God. Or we talked about last Thursday, the dinosaurs in the Bible, and things like that. And it's important to have those men who are interested in those topics and who are interested at writing at a more scholarly or scientific level that may not be appropriate for a Sunday morning sermon. May not even be appropriate for a Wednesday night Bible class because they're a little bit deeper than what we are accustomed to thinking. And like I said, I don't understand a lot of the things that they talk about on Apologetics Press. But I know that they've got the education to back up what they've studied and what they've researched. And so I know that I can trust those men when it comes to those matters. The Bible is for the head, the heart, and the hand. It's for understanding, for belief, and practice. Some express it as logos, which is to learn, ethos, which is to be, and pathos, which is to feel. William Barclay believed a good lesson gives hearers something to know, something to feel, and something to do. Is this not the very thing that Peter did on Pentecost? You look at what he told them. We know these things assuredly. And what did that do? It made them feel something. It pricked them in their hearts. What shall we do? Well, then he gave them something to do. Repent. Let every one of you be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. So, that very first gospel sermon, what we call it sometimes, it has these three aspects in it. So it's important that we kind of look at that and apply that as much as we can. And what we were talking about earlier is spell it out. Just don't assume that everybody knows everything that you know. We have to make sure that we are understood. Continuing with Samuel's method, the note-taking is good. When I go to a lectureship or polishing the pulpit or something of that nature, I have a little notebook that I keep with me, and I write down, if it's on the PowerPoint, I write down all the PowerPoint. If it's not, then I just try to scribble as fast as I can, the important things that they're saying or the verses that they're using, and so that I can go back and review it later. And I've been able to develop some of those into my own lessons. Note-taking is very important. Tests. Now, this is something that we shy away from in Bible classes. We don't want to put too much stress on people. But it's good to, even if we don't collect it, it's good to go through things and say, okay, what do you remember? And you grade it yourself. You don't have to hand it in to me. And if you're teaching down the hall, you don't have to hand it in to the teacher. If the teacher decides to do it this way, make sure that they can go through and they can grasp the applications. They can understand what the verses say. Memory work. Again, this is something that a lot of people shy away from today, but I think there's great value in memorizing scriptures. In my class on Isaiah, I'm requiring the students to memorize 18 verses. 20 actually. They get to choose 2 of their own. But they have to memorize Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Isaiah 52, verses, I think it's 12 through 14. 13 through 15. And then Isaiah 53, all 12 verses. So by the end of the semester, they're going to know the suffering servant passage by heart. They know Isaiah 53, 1 through 12, but they also have the last 3 verses of chapter 52 to put in context there. Memory work helps. It's not just rote. Now there are times that when you're dealing with the younger ones, it may be some rote memorization just to get them in the habit of it. John 11:35, Jesus wept. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. And you build up and build up. You get to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You can even write on verse 2, and the earth was without form and void. And it's been a while. My point is, you memorize what the word says. That way, when you're in the discussion, you don't necessarily always have to turn to the passage. That's a good practice to be in, because you do want the other person to see it for themselves. But if you're in the flow of a conversation, you may not want to stop the conversation and say, well, let's turn over to, you might want to be able to just spit it out. So that's just something else that he talks about. He talks about the philosophy of teaching the students with respect as adults. All this is something else from the memory that's really good. Thy word, which is the best book, have I hid in my heart, which is the best place, that I might not sin against thee, which is the best purpose. That's a sermon right there. I'm not going to preach it because I'm sure y'all could write it better than I could. But that's a sermon just in that sentence. Okay, and the philosophy, preacher training is not a glorified Sunday school. It's more intense, because preachers are being trained to go work with congregations. And working with congregations is not necessarily sitting down and talking about Noah's Ark. There's a lot more to it than that. All right, we're running out of time, so very quickly, Jesus' method was on-the-job training. It was the rabbinic method. It was action-oriented. There wasn't a whole lot of classroom instruction. He said, hey, let's go. He sent them out to do things. And so there was a lot of action there. It was more focused on being equipped than educated. You can memorize every verse of the Bible. Is that going to make you a good preacher or teacher? Not necessarily. Not if you can't relay that to someone else in a meaningful way. And so it's important to have both equipment and education for preachers. And then out-of-class assignments, of course, he sent the 70 out. Critique of sermons. Paul's method was more mentoring, Homeric. The Jenkins Institute does a wonderful job with this. Dale and Jeff Jenkins, they try to set preachers up with either mentors or mentees to make sure that everybody has a support system. And they want to really hammer home 2 Timothy 2:2. The things you've heard from me, share with other faithful men. Teach other faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And then we have the example of Paul who mentored Timothy and Titus, a demonstration throughout those letters. The out-of-class personal connection. When he wrote to Timothy, come see me. I know it's winter soon, but come see me. Bring the books with you. It wasn't just a professional relationship that they had. They were personally connected. All right, any questions? Comments? Okay, next week, the preacher and his work. Read pages 13 through 16. Brother Steve Higginbotham. I got some stories about Steve that I'm not going to share with you on camera. Thank you for your attention.